Hi, this is Graeme Thomas here, and today is actually going to be lesson 1 of the free e-class I'm running on Facebook, and it's entitled Calorie Cycling for Rapid Fat Loss is the purpose of this little course. In today's matter, we're really going to treat calorie counting as it pertains to efforts to lose weight. If we look over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, prevailing view in terms of weight management has been we need to balance calories in with calories out, and that's just going off of simple physics. And so basically how the theory goes right now, if we are trying to lose weight, we have to make sure our energy expenditure, which is our exercise or resting metabolism, is greater than our energy intake, which is basically the food that we eat. So we can see with our little balance equation, when we eat more than we expend, the theory goes, we will gain weight. And if we flip it around, if we exercise more than we eat, we will lose weight. Now, the reason why we tell people this is because we know that 1 pound of fat contains 3,500 calories. So if we just run some really simple math, you would expect to see that if we created a deficit through exercise and diet of about 500 calories a day, in a week's time, that individual would lose about 1 pound of fat. If we extended this out over several weeks, someone should be able to lose 10, 15, 20 pounds of fat as long as they stuck to this kind of 1 pound of fat equals 3,500 calories. You know, it seems very simple on the surface. But how well are people really adopting this message that calories matter? Well, if we look at some of the numbers, it seems that about 9 out of every 10 people buy low-calorie, reduced sugar, or sugar-free foods and beverages, so it seems that that message is getting to the consumer. People are buying low-calorie products. You know, we would assume that to be a good thing. And if we look at kind of how much money people spend on, weight management tools, we see that almost $20 billion is spent on people getting gym memberships every year and taking exercise classes. So that's a phenomenal amount of money spent, but it pales in comparison to how much money is spent every year on diet foods and diet products and all those kind of things, which is almost $40 billion. So between exercise and diet products, we're spending almost $60 billion a year in an effort, to help us lose weight. Now, why is this the case? If North Americans are spending $60 billion, we'd expect to see some pretty significant gains. So let's actually look at some of the numbers now and see what's happened over the last 20, 30 years. So here's some data out of the US. This is looking at the changes in obesity levels state by state. And this is starting from the mid-80s, and we're going to classify obesity as having a BMI, body mass index, of over 30, or someone who's about 30 pounds overweight if you're only 5'4". And if we just look down at the bottom of the screen, you'll see some of the legend here. So the light blue means that less than 10% of that population in that state was obese in 1985, whereas the slightly darker blue means that 10 to 14% of that population was obese. And for a number of the states, we don't have data. So let's just get this started here. And we see in 1986, we have a few more states coming in with slightly higher levels of obesity. 1987 now, we're getting more of that darker blue show up in a number of states. We go to 1988 again, a couple more states coming in with higher numbers. Still, we're lacking some data. 1989, now about half of the U.S. is in that 10 to 14% obesity range. In 1990, now more than half. If we look at 1991, we have a new category show up, and that's obesity. Between 15 and 19% of that population of that state is obese, so it's starting to get up there in terms of numbers. We look at 1992, again a few more states in the dark blue. We look at 1993, yet again more states coming in at dark blue. 1994, now we have data on all of the states, and we see even more states now at that 15 to 19% obesity level. 1995, more than half the U.S. now is at that 15 to 19%. In 1996, we're getting to about 3/4 of the U.S. in that level. 1997, we have a new category show up with 3 states, excuse me, pulling in the 20 to 24%. So now almost a quarter of that population in that state is clinically obese. We come to 1998, yet again more states showing up with the higher levels of obesity. 1999, now we're about half the U.S. coming in over 20%. So the problem is starting to become more and more severe. And at the turn of the century, again, we're having more than half. So now we've really got, this obesity issue is becoming more and more prevalent. We go to 2001, we have a new category show up, and that's now over 25% of the population in that state is obese. So it's really starting to become noticeable. 2002, we have 3 states at that level. 2003, 4 states, so it's just continuing to trend upwards here. In 2004, we have a number of states at 25 to 29%. In 2005, we have a new category, and now it's over 30%. So about 1 in 3 individuals in that particular state have an obesity problem. So this is starting to become very, very alarming from a health perspective. 2006, same thing, a number of states over 25 and 30%. 2007, still more states coming up over 25%. 2008, a lot of states now at over 30%. And the most recent data, there's quite a few states now that are over 30%, and a good half the US is over 25% obese. So in a really short period of time, and we're just looking from 1990 to 2009, so this is 20 years' time, we've gone from a nation in the US where less than 15% on the whole had an obesity issue to one now where it's 25 to 30%. This is exactly when we look at the numbers. If we look from the mid-70s, we see that the population as a whole was far leaner. So it's not just something we think we're observing. The numbers do bear it out. And the interesting thing to note here is that the levels of individuals who are overweight hasn't really changed. In the 70s, 32% of the population was overweight, whereas in the mid 2003, 2004, 33%. It really hasn't changed. Where the dramatic shift has occurred is really in the individuals who are obese or extremely obese. And obesity has more than doubled in 30 years, whereas the extremely obese is almost 4 times greater. So this is an alarming change at the higher end, which is definitely the more dangerous category from a health perspective. Now, if we look at kind of closer to home and we look at what's happened in Canada, are the numbers anything like what we're seeing in the US? And the unfortunate part is the answer is yes. And we're a little bit leaner, so we do have a few provinces here that are under 20%, but by and large, Canadian provinces are in that mid-20 category, and we do have a province, Newfoundland, that's up over 30%. So clearly Canadians do have a problem as well with obesity. If we look at the numbers kind of globally, we see that a lot of the Western world, USA, Australia, Canada, the UK, France, all of these are at the higher levels of obesity. And in Canada, about 60% currently is our population who's overweight, and about a quarter, so 23 to 25%, which are clinically obese. So that this problem definitely isn't localized to the US, it's just as prevalent in Canada as well. Now this begs the question, if we know that a pound of fat is 3,500 calories, and we know that exercise is a way to increase energy expenditure, and that if you count calories you can manage how much food is coming in, why is the obesity problem continuing to get worse and worse? We're spending more money than ever on diet foods and gym club memberships, and yet we haven't really slowed down the progression of obesity at all. So we need to figure out exactly what's going wrong. Now let's look at this. We talked about how a pound of fat is 3,500 calories. So let's just extrapolate this out and assume someone gained 5 pounds in a year. So if we did that little bit of math, we'd see that for someone to gain 5 pounds in a year, they'd need to eat about 17,500 calories. Okay, and that's just a number. So it seems like a pretty big number. But let's break it down to calories per day. And how many calories per day does it take to get an excess of 18,000 calories? Well, it only boils down to about 50 calories a day. And that's about 2.5 strawberries, half a banana, half a slice of bread. So it's really not much at all. Now this begs the question, how many of us in our day-to-day lives know how precise our calorie counting is down to plus or minus 50 calories? I bet not too many. And then we look at kind of, well, what's actually happened with our intake over the last 30 years. We're going to look at some Canadian data, and it's quite telling. So the first thing I'm going to highlight is just energy intake from 1981 to 1991, and as we can see, there's been really no change. So we're eating 2,300 calories in the beginning of the 80s, and the same thing in the beginning of the 90s. Then in the decade from the 90s to 2000, we jumped by 400 calories a day, which is a phenomenal increase. But if we remember back earlier, we just talked about, even if you just overconsume by 50 calories a day, someone could gain 5 pounds in a year. But most of us aren't gaining 5 pounds in a year, and we sure aren't gaining the 40 pounds in a year that this kind of jump of 400 calories a day would compute out to be. So somehow our math isn't really working. But what has happened in Canada over the last 20 years? Let's take a look. And again, we're going to just look at it over those 2 decades in particular. In the first decade, we'll look at the 90s where we had that 400 calorie per day increase. And what happened to the average Canadian's body weight? Well, there was a slight increase in body weight for males, about 2 kilograms. So that's 5 pounds in a decade, not in a year. And that was over-consuming by 400 calories. There's really no change for women in terms of their average body weight. So despite this phenomenal increase in caloric intake, men are getting a little bit fatter, women don't really seem to have a change. But what happened during the 80s when there wasn't really any increase in energy intake as a whole? What happened then? Well, we actually see that for both sexes there was quite an aggressive increase in average body weight. Okay, and this was during a period where there wasn't any kind of population-wide increase in total calories. So again, for the level of the individual, maybe you get some change when you manage calories, but as a population, when you start to run the numbers over millions of individuals, we see that the calorie counting approach just can't make any sense, because we look at the numbers and they're staring us in the face, and based on what we compute to have changed that 400 calorie increase, we're not seeing it at all in terms of kind of the actual change in the population. Right, so the question we really are left with today is, if we're not micromanaging our calories down to knowing exactly what goes into our mouth every second of every day, what kind of value is this, weight loss can be produced by managing energy in and energy out? Which leads us on to what we're going to cover in lesson 2, and that's looking at why most diets are built to fail. Just to kind of give you a little bit of a teaser, all these items here are 100 calories. So we've got, your 100 calorie snack pack, you got a can of tuna, you got a banana, you got a tablespoon of peanut butter. Okay, under the calorie counting approach, these are all equivalent. And what we're going to find out in lesson 2, that's not at all the case. Not only that, but when you just kind of count calories, you'd expect to see a much greater calorie burn doing something like, steady state cardio as opposed to resistance training. Yet when we start to look at some of the numbers, the people who are resistance training actually tend to do a lot better with body composition change, and that's all going to be covered in lesson 2. So just a reminder, if you're interested in learning more about the topic and you're not currently part of the Facebook group Calorie Cycling for Rapid Fat Loss, I strongly recommend you sign up right now. There's going to be some more discussions, more resources going up there, so a lot of stuff going on, and this ultimately is a whole series of lessons building up to kind of a new novel approach to helping people manage their weight that goes far beyond the standard just calories in, calories out, which as we've seen doesn't seem to hold a lot of water. And as well, there's tons more information on my personal website, which is Graeme Thomas online, and I highly recommend you check it out. So till next time, this has been Graeme, and see you on the other side.